The sun was high in the pale sky. A few fluffy clouds floated lazily around, but none close enough to cover it. Warm rays radiated down over the dusty field. A slight breeze pushed the fluffy clouds to and fro, and blew dust gently across the green grass in the outfield. The occasional scream of a child, excitedly playing beyond the chain-link fence, rose into the air, and the soft hum of traffic behind the park serenaded the gathered crowd. Aside from that, all was quiet, as the crowd, some seated on the metal benches of the stadium and some standing at the fence, waited with bated breath. Alexander stood in front of the home plate, inside of a little white box drawn on the ground, chalk now faded from the many steps that had passed over it that day. His black helmet felt heavy on his head, and the sound in his left ear was muted by the thick piece of plastic meant to protect his ear from a rogue fastball. The red aluminum bat he held also seemed heavier than usual. He tapped the heel of each of his cleats with it, the familiar metal ring giving him courage. He then tapped home plate with it, although the sound was duller than that from his cleats. With a heave of breath, he lifted the bat over his right shoulder and stared down the way to the pitcher's mound. There he stood, facing sideways, leather glove on his left hand pressing against his knee, dirty baseball clenched in his right hand, held behind his back. A tattered black cap kept the warm rays of sunlight out of his eyes. His uniform was teal, a contrast to Alexander's red, and his gray pant legs stopped just below his knees, where his long black socks began and disappeared into his cleats, which were firmly planted into the dirt of the mound. The pitcher glared down his newest victim. A bright pink bubble of chewing gum shot out of his pursed lips, grew large, and burst, disappearing inside his mouth once again. Alexander couldn't see the catcher, but he could see the pitcher adjust his eyes slightly downward and give a very brisk nod of his head as he acknowledged the catcher's suggestion. A small trickle of sweat inched down Alexander's neck. At the bottom of the fifth, the last inning in the minor league game, his team was down by 2. Ramon stood to his left, inching cautiously between third and home. "Come on, Alexander!" Ramon yelled to him, breaking the silence and clapping his hands. "Get me home! You can do it!" Damien stood to Alexander's right, inching cautiously, like Ramon, between first and second. Alexander knew, regardless of what happened with the first pitch, Damien would most likely steal second base, and then it would fall squarely upon Alexander's shoulders to win or lose the game. The tip of the aluminum bat rotated in the air as he held it over his shoulder. The time had come. The pitcher shoved the ball into his glove, lifted one knee up to his chest, then pulled his arm back and launched the ball, screaming through the air. It was a perfect pitch, directly over home plate, right at Alexander's waist. Alexander swung, bringing the bat around, keeping his eye on the ball. At the last moment, when bat should have met ball, and the invigorating clang of metal should have rung out, the soft breeze gently blew a single granule of sand into Alexander's right eye. He squeezed his eyes shut and inadvertently lifted the bat ever so slightly as he swung. Instead of the clang of metal, there was only the hard thud as the ball shot directly into the catcher's mitt, and the bat swung harmlessly around Alexander's back. "Steal rack one!" Alexander quickly rubbed his eyes, but the granule of dirt had comfortably lodged itself deep into the corner of his eye. His eye scratched horribly, and tears began to flow out of his right duct. The catcher threw the ball back to the pitcher, and Alexander lifted the bat over his right shoulder once again. His eye burned, but he couldn't spend too much time messing with it. For one, it looked like he was crying, and he didn't want his teammates to think he actually was. Most importantly, everything now depended on him. "Come on, Alex, you got this!" Ramon was still dancing his dangerous waltz between the bases in the event the catcher might miss the next pitch. Behind him, Alexander could hear his other teammates in the dugout sending a myriad of positivity, advice, and one or two threats his way. He blinked through the tears and peered across the field. The pitcher had the ball ready to go in his glove, but was still watching the catcher, waiting for the right play. Alexander's red eye could just make out a smudge of red and black shuffling like a crab between second and first base. Suddenly, the pitcher twirled and launched the ball to first base. Damien had just enough time to make it back before the player at first could tag him. Safe. Alexander dropped the tip of the bat down and took the momentary distraction to rub his eye again. Instead of making anything better, he felt as if he were simply pushing the dirt particle deeper into his retina. He shook it off and lifted the bat over his right shoulder again. He didn't have much time to react. The pitcher immediately shot the ball toward home plate. It wasn't a perfect pitch this time, slightly off course to the left, but Alexander knew he could hit it. As the ball inched closer to the plate, he began to swing the bat around. Before making contact, tears flooded his eye, blurring his vision, and the ball flew safely under the bat, past the catcher's mitt, and into the wood guard behind them with a loud crack. "Steer-ractu!" the umpire belted as a collective groan rose from the crowd. Their chance at winning one of the last games of the season was quickly fading. As the catcher fumbled with the ball, Damien stole second base. But it wasn't enough time for Ramon to take home. Now, runners were on third and second. There were 2 outs, 2 strikes, and everything hinged upon what Alexander was able to accomplish with this last pitch. He discreetly wiped the tears from his eye, careful not to scratch it even worse. He lifted the bat once more over his right shoulder and waited. As he stood, poised, watching the blurry pitcher through his soaked right eye, he began to hear something. It was a faint roaring sound, like the rushing of water, or maybe a large crowd, really far away. He wasn't sure where the sound was coming from, but he couldn't focus on that right now. He had to keep his eye on the ball. Then, along with the faint roar, he thought he heard someone speaking over a loudspeaker. They didn't have a loudspeaker on this field. He wondered if an event had started at the high school stadium, just down the road. He tried to ignore the sound, which seemed to be growing louder and louder and louder. The pitcher cocked his arm, preparing to toss the ball. As his arm came forward, Alexander's vision began to darken. He felt the tip of the bat fall to the ground as he struggled to keep both hands gripped to the cloth wrapped around its handle. He felt like he was falling, but he couldn't be quite sure. The last thing he noticed was the whistling of the ball as it flew toward him and the rising roar of the phantom crowd getting louder and louder before darkness surrounded him.
15 yards.
Alexander jolted upright with a sharp intake of breath. He was laying on a cool, dusty concrete surface. Peering around him, he realized he was sitting in a dugout, but not the one with his team from his baseball field. Various bags, bats, mitts, and baseballs lay around the dugout. Aside from that, it was empty. He was the only one here. His eyes still scratched, and he had to wipe tears away once again. He was startled by a sudden and very loud roar of a very real crowd, who he realized surrounded him outside the dugout. The voice boomed over the loudspeaker once again, but he couldn't make out exactly what was being said. The crowd and the loudspeaker both became silent. Then, from without the dugout, came the very familiar crack of a wooden bat hitting a baseball. The crowd erupted into ecstasy, and the voice excitedly yelled over the loudspeaker once again. Alexander couldn't see exactly what was happening outside. Everything was kind of blurry, thanks to his eye. But he could see that it was a bright, sunny day, and the stadium he appeared to be in was huge. Much bigger than any he had seen in his little hometown, and every seat in that stadium was currently filled with a cheering fan. Just as he was about to stand up and dust himself off, he heard footsteps coming down the stairs into the dugout, and a long shadow stretched across the opposite wall. A man came walking into the dugout. He was very tall, over 6 foot, but he wasn't particularly in shape. He wasn't fat, just maybe a little chubby. He looked older, although everyone looked older to 9-year-old Alexander. He wore a black baseball cap with the letters N and Y stitched over each other in white on the front. He wore a white pinstripe jersey and white pinstripe pants, which stopped just below the knees and gave way to long black socks, which continued down into a pair of dirty, tattered black cleats. In his hands, he held 2 baseball bats, draped over his left shoulder. He stopped in the doorway and looked down at Alexander with a look of confusion. "Hey there, Sonny. You're not supposed to be down here." He had a very distinct East Coast accent, although Alexander wasn't familiar enough with accents to know from where. He looked gruff, but there was a warmness in his voice, and he had a kind grin on his face. "You lost or something?" Alexander stood, slapping the dirt off his pants and jersey. I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm doing here." The man chuckled to himself. "No harm, kid. I just don't want you getting in any trouble is all." He laid the baseball bats against the bench running along the back wall and sat down, eyeing Alexander. "Say, you must be a baseball player too, am I right?" "Not a very good one," Alexander said, walking cautiously over toward the man. The man waved his hand at Alexander dismissively. "I ain't no such thing as being good or bad at baseball. It's all about the experience, kid." Alexander wiped the tears away from his right eye again. "Hey, you crying?" "No, sir. Something's in my eye." "Come here, kid." The man pulled out a green glass bottle from one of the bags sitting near him. Alexander could just make out Apollinaris Sparkling Mineral Water printed on the front label. He stepped up to the man. "Head back, eye open," the man said. Alexander did as instructed, and the man poured a good amount of the sparkling water into his face. "Now blink like crazy." The fizzy water bubbled on his face and felt uncomfortable in his eye, like 1,000 needles taking the place of the single granule of sand that was there before. But it also felt more effective than just trying to use his tears to clear his eye out. By the time he had blinked through the liquid and it soaked the concrete floor, he no longer felt anything in his eye. "Hey, thanks." The man laughed. "Just an old trick from one baseball player to another. Now tell me, kid, what you doing here?" Alexander explained what had happened immediately up to him finding himself in the strange dugout, from the dirt penetrating his eye to the fate of the game resting on his shoulders. The man listened, patiently, the warm smile never leaving his face. "And then I was here." Alexander looked to him, waiting for some advice on what to do next. The man studied him for a moment. "Well, kid, that's a heck of a story. I don't rightly know what to make of it." He chuckled to himself again before continuing. "But what I do know, kid, is baseball. Baseball isn't just something you do. It's a feeling. It's an instinct. It's believing in yourself. Not because your team needs you to, but because you need to." The man straightened his ball cap and tapped on the rim of Alexander's. "You know what I mean, kid?" Alexander looked down at his wet, dusty uniform, cogs turning in his mind. "Actually, yeah, I think I do." The man smiled. "Good. Now, let's get you back to where you need to be." He stood and began striding toward the door before stopping abruptly. "Oh, you know what? You might like to have this." Turning to the side, he pulled a baseball and a pen out of a pinstripe pocket. He then wrote on the ball and tossed it to Alexander. Catching it, Alexander turned it over in his hands a couple of times and then stopped to read what the man had written. Babe Ruth. Shocked, Alexander's head shot up to look at the man, but as he did so, the sound of the crowd and the loudspeaker began to fade, and darkness began to grow around him once again. The last thing he saw as he grasped the baseball tightly was the babe, smiling at him as his voice echoed around him. "Remember, kid, it's not about what you do, It's about believing in yourself.
15 yards.
Alexander suddenly became aware that he was standing at the home plate, bat clenched tightly in his fists, and baseball whistling centimeters past his nose like a bullet. There was an audible gasp from the crowd, and Alexander fell backward on his butt. The crowd was now whispering excitedly while his coach jogged over. "Hey, you okay? You get hurt?" Alexander shook his head and looked over to the umpire. "1 ball, 2 strikes." Coach nodded, spitting a shower of sunflower seeds to the side. Alexander nodded back, got on his knees, grabbed the bat, and rose to his feet. He lifted the aluminum bat over his shoulder one last time and peered down the field at the pitcher. His gum was popping and his arms were twitching, itching to throw the fastball that would win his team the game. Behind him, Alexander could hear his teammates begin to chant, "Alex, Alex, Alex." He dug his cleat into the dirt and watched the pitcher closely, his mind filled with echoes of the encounter he must have imagined just happening. "Believe in yourself, kid. Believe in yourself. Believe." The pitcher's knee came up to his chest. He cocked his right arm back, poised, then released his arm and jettisoned the ball toward home plate. There wasn't a sound in the air aside from the whistle of the ball and the echo in Alexander's ears. Believe. Believe. Eyes on the ball, he brought the bat around in perfect harmony with the velocity of the pitch. There was a satisfying clink as the bat met the ball, and suddenly the ball was flying high in the opposite direction. The crowd erupted. Alexander tossed the bat behind him and bolted to first base. The ball continued to fly as kids dressed in teal and gray scrambled to be under it to catch it. Ramon had passed home, and Alexander began bolting to second. The roar of the crowd was deafening. The ball soared further, further. Damien crossed the home plate, and Alexander reached second. He looked over his shoulder just in time to see the ball land on the opposite side of the fence, and a group of teal-clad baseball players stared at it longingly through the chain link, shoulders slumped. He'd hit a home run. He finished running third base and threw to home in time to meet his teammates and the roar of the crowd. His team circled around him, patting him on his helmet and yelling for joy. "You did it," Ramon said, giving him a hug. "Hey, what's that?" Ramon pointed to a bulge in Alexander's right pocket. As the parents spilled into the field to congratulate their kids, Alexander plunged his hand into his pocket. It felt like a baseball. He gripped it and slowly pulled it out. It was old, yellowed from years of use. A black tag with the letters N and Y on top of each other was stitched onto one side. As the crowd closed around him, Alexander turned the ball over in his hands. On the opposite side of the tag, something was written. Brushing the dirt away with his thumb, Alexander looked closely to read the handwriting. Babe Ruth.